Okay, let's talk about how I made the animation you just watched. I originally had this idea a long time ago. I actually tried making this animation once before, but it was just way too ambitious for me at the time. So it's nice to come back and do the whole thing again from scratch. There's a lot of stuff we're going to be covering today: character animation, cloth simulations, creatures and environments. But before we start, I just want to say thank you to Nvidia and Scan for making this video possible. There's a link in the description where you can read all about Nvidia's RTX Studio program, and of course we'll be talking about it later, but let's just jump in and start breaking down some of these shots. So first, let's talk about the establishing shots. I knew that I didn't have very long to make this project, so right from the bat I made the decision to rely pretty heavily on 3D scans, most of which came from Sketchfab. The entire landscape here and the main castles are actually one big aerial scan. I added another scan of a cathedral into the background of the shot to make the monastery look a little bit more imposing and grand. It obviously looks terrible at first, but once you add a little bit of dramatic lighting and some volumetric fog, everything comes together pretty nicely. To make the mountain look a little bit less bare, I decided to add some trees. They were created just with a picture of a tree on a plane. It has a transparent background and I used that as a particle system to distribute it across the whole mountain. I made the tree but just by rendering out a still image from a tree asset which came from the Botanic add-on. I'll leave a link to that in the description below if you want to check it out. I could have distributed the actual tree models all across the landscape, but that would be a huge waste of polygons because they're practically not visible apart from the silhouettes. The distribution of the trees was controlled with weight painting. I just created a vertex group and I added that to the particle system's density control. Then I could just paint in the areas where I wanted the trees to appear and they wouldn't be spawned anywhere else. Every shot in this animation has really heavy volumetrics, which creates a lot of noise in the scene. In order to keep the render times low, I used the optics denoiser in the viewport and in the final render. You can see that it does a really good job of cleaning up the noise, but it does look a little bit blotchy, so there is a little trick that you can use to avoid that problem most of the time. If you're using the optics denoiser with a lot of volumetrics, try changing the passes from normal and albedo to just albedo. I don't know why, but I find it gives you much cleaner results, and you can see here in the final render it looks much better than it did in the shot before. Here's a second shot that never actually made it into the final animation. I used Ian Hubert's awesome little camera shake add-on to add a little bit of life into the camera movement. I use this add-on all the time in my shots these days, but I usually turn the strength of it right down so it's very subtle. I thought this was a pretty nice shot and it is a bit of a shame that I had to remove it, but I felt like it just slowed down the pace of the animation too much and it was a little bit redundant since it's very similar to the shot that came before it. So after that I made another shot which is just this close-up focusing on an angel statue. There is a little bit of a continuity error here because this massive statue on the wall should be visible in the first shot, but I hadn't added it yet. But honestly, I don't really care because it looks cool and that's the important thing. You can see that the optics viewport denoising is doing a really fantastic job of clearing up these shots while I'm working. I honestly don't know how I ever worked without it. So in some of these shots I had a weird issue where the sun on the HDRI background came out looking really square for some reason. I have no idea why that happened. It seemed to be a problem with the volumetrics. I think it was clipping some of the values from the HDRI and it was left with this weird square shape. I literally just fixed this by adding a white sphere into where the sun was, rendering that out and then just compositing back on top of the original footage. So next I moved on to the first interior shot. I managed to find this bloody fantastic 3D scan inside a cathedral on Sketchfab, and that was the basis for this whole interior. Quite a lot of the time when I'm working with 3D scans I actually modify them quite a lot and add things onto them. For instance, I used this building frieze as the basis for an altar and I just built the rest of the geometry around it. It matched quite well and once I put it into the environment and lit it, you really couldn't tell where the seams were. You can see that I've added this little grey fella into the shot. That's just to rigify armature. I use those quite often just to figure out the scale of shots without having to measure every item. It just serves as a good scale reference for how big everything should be. So I used the cloth sim to make a sort of sheet cover that goes on top of the altar, but that caused some little weird issues that I had to manually fix with the sculpting tools. This was the first of many problems I had with the cloth simulation in Blender during this animation. I spent countless hours just banging my head against the wall trying to get the cloth to work properly. I think it might be time for me to permanently move over to Marvelous Designer for cloth simulations in the future, because I don't think the Blender system's up to scratch for anything advanced. Character animations tend to look really jittery, self-collisions often cause the cloth to basically explode, and once a character clips into the cloth mesh it just refuses to let go. All of this is annoying enough to start with, but cloth simulations also take a very long time to bake, so you have to wait a long time just to figure out that it looks bad, delete it all, make a change, and wait again. All in all, I probably spent upwards of 20 hours trying to get the cloth sims to work for these shots, and they still look a little bit funky in several places. Quite a few of the shots actually had to be trimmed down fairly drastically because the cloth simply just didn't look good enough. For the interior shots I made this really quick stained glass window, and then I used an experimental branch of Blender which has support for caustics. Caustics are basically the effect when light passes through a thicker medium than air like glass or water, and you get these really beautiful effects on the surfaces that the light hits. The new caustic system looks absolutely fantastic, but unfortunately I almost had to remove it from the final shot because it was just incredibly noisy. Even with this scene very well optimized, you can see I'm still getting lots of really harsh fireflies. Luckily the optics denoiser saved the day again, and it did a really nice job of getting good results with just 3000 samples. It actually took less than 20 seconds per frame on my RTX graphics card using the optics rendering. I actually ended up just upping this to 5000 samples in the final render because the times were so low it was worth the extra bit of quality. So all of the characters that I made for this were made using a really cool add-on called Human Generator. I'll try to remember to link that in the description below. I didn't worry about customizing the face too much because I knew that he'd be wearing a mask anyway. The Human Generator add-on allows you to customize the characters just using a set of sliders, kind of like in a video game. I couldn't use any of the clothes that come with Human Generator for these dudes apart from these really nice boots. I thought they fitted the aesthetic very well, so they stayed. Human generated characters come with a basic rig by default, but you can also use that rig to generate a much more advanced rigify armature that has more controls like IK systems. I animated this character myself and I gave him a simple walk cycle. It was quite difficult to get this right because, among other things, I'm still very new to animating. This is probably like the third or fourth character I've ever tried to animate, and also there was the fact that he's wearing this really long robe. So I had to be very conscious while I was animating this that he wouldn't have a full range of movement. He would kind of have to shuffle his feet a little bit because he wouldn't really be able to stretch his legs. I modelled out a bunch of candles and candle holders for this project because I knew they'd probably end up in the background of most shots. It's really quite simple to make nice looking candles in Blender. At the end of the day it's basically just a cylinder. You just need to add a point light above it to act like the light from the flame, and you can give the material a little bit of subsurface scattering so that it looks like wax. To make the flames I just used an image of a flame with an emission material, and to make sure that the flame always points towards the camera and you don't say that it's actually flat, I added a rotation constraint to the image so that it would always rotate to point wherever the camera is. Now obviously subsurface scattering for the wax tends to produce a lot of noise in renders, but I find that the optics rendering does a really good job of quickly rendering out scenes even with SSS in them, and it usually isn't a problem just to bump up the sample count until the final render looks nice. Of course you can also use the optics denoising as well to take out the last bit of noise in there if upping the samples isn't really an option. While we're talking about Nvidia, I just want to give a quick shout out to Nvidia and Scan for sponsoring Decoded and making this video possible in the first place. Scan has a really great range of Nvidia RTX Studio devices on offer. These are devices that have been certified by Nvidia to ensure that they deliver great performance in creative apps like After Effects, Blender and DaVinci Resolve. Whenever you see the RTX Studio badge on a laptop or desktop computer, it means that Nvidia's personally tested the device before giving it their seal of approval, which makes it much easier to pick out appropriate hardware for creative work. I've personally used Scan for over a decade and they've always given me fantastic service. They have a really great range of studio devices on sale, which you can find by clicking the link in the description. So at this point I moved on to the shot of the creature awakening as the door opens. This was really simple. I actually just sculpted out the basic shape around the eye, and then I used some texture brushes to add a little bit of quick and dirty details to the skin. The skin material itself was also really basic. I just gave it a little bit of subsurface scattering, and I used a noise node passed through a colour ramp to give it kind of this blotchy looking skin. I baked the texture out so that it was an image which I could paint extra details on top of. As you can see, the UV map is absolutely terrible, but it really doesn't matter in the final shot, so who cares. I decided to give the eye a nictitating membrane, aka a third eyelid. A lot of animals have these, like birds, lizards, cats and dogs to some extent. Ancestors of humans actually had these at one point as well. That's why you have a tear duct. It's basically an evolutionary hangover of where your third eyelid would have been. I made this really simply just by cutting a sphere in half and rotating it around the eyeball as the eyelids open. To operate the actual eye itself, I used shape keys, or blend shapes as they're known in other 3D programs. That allows you to basically store different positions into a mesh, and then you can just merge between those positions by animating it with keyframes. So I made one shape key that just opens and closes the eye, and I made a few shape keys to add a little bit of movement to the eyelids so they kind of bulge as the eye moves around. To make that shot of the door opening, I used another 3D scan of a nice doorway, and I just deleted the actual door parts and I replicated them with some pretty basic geometry. Then I just moved those into the right position. One of the reasons that I picked this scan in the first place was because it has these nice mouldings that actually cover the door frame with a little bit of a gap. That made it really easy for me to kind of roughly select the parts of the door I needed to delete, and I knew it would hide the transition between what's the 3D scan and what's the geometry that I've made. I also managed to make some really simple steps for the door. I thought these were a pretty good match for the scan in the final render. Old stonework's rarely perfectly flat, so I used this cloud texture to add a little bit of displacement and some randomness to the surface. Then I sculpted out a really basic cave just to surround the doorway. I used a texture that actually had a height map with it, and that way I could add a little bit of extra displacement to the mesh just using the displacement modifier. The final shot's really dark, so I didn't need to spend a ton of time on this shot to get it looking good. So when I made most of these shots, I didn't actually have the characters finished or animated yet. So once the character was all done, I had to go back through all the shots, add in the characters, and then render the whole thing out. So to make the mask, I just selected the character's face and duplicated it into its own separate object. Then I used the sculpting tools to make it look a little bit more like a mask, taking out some of the features. Getting the mask to look right was a little bit of an artistic balancing act. These monk dudes are doing creepy things and they're obviously up to no good, but I didn't want them to look overtly evil by adding, horns onto the mask or making it look like a skull or something like that. It's a little bit too on the nose, and I tried to make it a little bit more subtly creepy. So at this point I just made the character's walk cycle that I briefly mentioned earlier on. It's a little bit janky, but it's not too bad for my first walk cycle, I think. I used the NLA editor just to repeat the animation over and over again to make it a constant walk. You can add a follow path constraint to the root bone of a character once you've got a walk cycle, and then you can just make it follow a curved path. I didn't actually end up doing this in the end, since the characters all just follow a really simple straight trajectory. I just animated the root bone's position manually. So here's a little tip for you. Once I had the basic walk cycle finished and the cloth was simulated, I exported the character as an Alembic file, and then I re-imported it back into the scene. Once I had the basic walk cycle finished and the cloth simulation was all done, I exported the character and the robes as a Alembic file, and then I re-imported the Alembic file back into Blender. For some reason, Alembic files play back much faster in the viewport than Blender's standard cloth simulation does, and you can just move it around anywhere you want in the scene and it'll play fine. You can also offset the animation. That's really important, and I use that a lot because I had multiple characters who had the exact same walk animation. If I didn't offset the animation slightly, it would all look like the cover of Abbey Road, they'd all be like walking in sync. So by using the offset, it just hid the fact that each one of these characters was actually an identical clone doing the exact same walk. The tentacles on the creature couldn't have been simpler. They were just cylinders, and I took them into the sculpting tools and I added loads of really crude details onto them. Then I made a really simple rig which had an IK control. That allows me to just grab the end of the tentacle and the rest of the limb will follow along. Then I could just animate with keyframes where the end position was for the tentacle, and it would look like it was swinging around all over the place. I also added another bone at the base which controls the rotation. I just used a rotation constraint so that the rest of the rig would follow this one bone. The tentacles on the final shot were ridiculously quick and dirty. You can actually see that the rig doesn't even quite line up with the left side of the mesh, but that doesn't matter at all, especially because the whole thing would be covered by loads of nice motion blur. Motion blur is that kind of out of focus blurring effect you get when an object moves really fast in the scene. It's very important when you're trying to replicate realistic movement in animation. Traditionally, motion blur is very expensive in terms of rendering time, because Blender essentially has to calculate the mesh at various points for every frame. Thankfully, if you've got a newer RTX series graphics card from Nvidia, you can take advantage of GPU accelerated motion blur. It's built right into Blender, you don't even have to enable any settings, it just works by default, and it drastically cuts down render times if you use a motion blur. It's a real time saver and I absolutely love this feature. The compositing and rendering for this project was really simple, there's not much to talk about there. I just added some depth of field effects onto the camera, I enabled motion blur and the optics denoiser, and then I did some really simple colour correction in the compositor. Apart from that, most of the shots look pretty much like they did in the viewport. As always, it would have been nice to spend a little bit of extra time on this project. There's several aspects that I would love to have another crack at, but overall I'm pretty happy with how this thing turned out. The animation is quite close to how I originally imagined it all that time back, except the original ending was actually going to have the monk placing a baby in a basket in front of the creature, but I thought that child sacrifice might be a little bit dark for a YouTube video, so I scrapped that in the end. Thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more content like this, make sure you're subscribed to Decoded. I'd like to say a big thank you to Nvidia and Scan for making this video possible. I simply wouldn't have the time to create these more ambitious videos without support of sponsors like them. Make sure you check out the link in the description to see Scan's whole range of RTX Studio devices. Take care, and I'll see you in a few days with another video.